Hello, I'm Lee Lin Chin. Let's get an Uber. That was quick. This is writers in cars going nowhere. And now let's get our guest. Shepherd Rebanks?
Hey!
Come on in.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Now, one thing I'm fascinated with is that you are actually very well educated, which isn't something that immediately springs to mind for the rest of us when you say you're a farmer and a shepherd.
Yeah.
At that.
I guess so, but it makes me laugh because I was talking to a historian of where I lived, and he was telling me that the lads used to plough the fields in Latin about 500 years ago where we live. So I think there's I think there's a myth that education didn't happen to rural people, but actually there's a really, really long history of rural people, shepherds, ploughmen and others being very well educated and having their own set of values, which meant that they didn't necessarily then become like everybody else in the modern world. They quite often went back to their own lives and their own land.
Are you going to be attempting to write poetry?
I actually began writing poetry. Poetry is my first love, and some of my book, The Shepherd's Life, began as poetry. So some of the nicest bits in the book were poems that I wrote about 10 years ago. Just one of the reasons I wrote poems was that I had a busy working life like lots of other people, and
It's quicker.
It's quicker. In some ways, it's quicker. You know, I think Wordsworth called them spots of time, didn't he? You capture these little moments in a passage or a poem, and that's still how I write, really.
Is it a lonely life being out there in the meadows by yourself with the sheep?
The truth is, it's all about buying and selling sheep and being part of a culture that's full of other people doing the same things as you that you interact with. So, no, I don't often feel lonely. In fact, the valleys where we live are full of people, and people whose stories intertwine with mine, which I wanted to try and explain in the book as well. So, no, I'm maybe in sort of biblical times there are places where shepherds were sort of highly lonely on hillsides, but that isn't the experience where I live. It's very much a community.
And that's partially also because England is a overcrowded little place now, so it's very hard to be anywhere totally isolated.
The truth is, the Lake District where I'm from is probably the most written about piece of landscape on earth. It's not because it's particularly unique in any way, it's because it's so close to the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, and it's in one of the most crowded islands on earth.
Wordsworth,
yeah. And it's
all of that, yes.
So that accident of economic history means it's the first place where people start to idealise and romanticise landscape and want to protect it and the people in it from modernity and change. I've gone whole historical, haven't I?
It's very unusual for someone who comes from at least 3 generations of farming to want to do it. The general trend is a lot of younger members of farming families are leaving the farms.
Yeah, I think I would slightly take issue with that historically. I think the myth is that everybody leaves because they want to leave. I think the bigger truth is people leave because of harsh economic realities. But I think a lot of those people don't want to leave the land. I think a lot of those people would love to continue to live how their forefathers and mothers and grandmothers did. And a lot of those people have a deep connection to the land. I think they're pushed off the land more than they're pulled to the city in many cases.
Do you think we have already arrived at a time when less and less people are growing the food for the rest of us who are all gravitating towards the cities and the urban areas?
I think that's an amazing radical change in the human condition, how people live. In about 50 years that's happened, hasn't it? It's a long process, but it's really intensely happened in the last 10, 20, 30 years. Again, particularly in places like China. And I think it's a fundamental shift in how people live. Fewer people now than ever before in human history touch the animals that they go on to eat, or have their hands in the soil that grow the crops that they eat. And in some ways that's okay. If that makes us all more prosperous and healthy and better educated, and our children have better lives, a lot of that is good. But I think things are lost, and I wanted to write about what's lost in a northern working family in England. And what's been really nice is that people around the world have reacted to that, because I think they see in that their own story.
Are you doing most of your writing while you're out there in the fields?
I do a lot of writing on like everybody else, I have a smartphone. So if I think of a line, I stop my quad bike, or I stop walking with my sheepdogs, and I'll write something down, maybe a poem or a few lines or some thoughts, and then I tend to pull all those things together or print them off on a computer, and then I start to think about how I can make that really work as a book. And I think maybe the thing I can do because of my working life outside is that other writers maybe wouldn't struggle to do is it's very much in front of me and I'm part of it, and I wanted to write not sort of detached nature writing. I wanted to write what it's like when you're
Actually there.
And you've been rained on or snowed on for 2 months and you're pissed off and you've had enough and your clothes are scruffy and your hands are broken.
I'm sure you have a very meaningful relationship with your dogs, but what about the sheep? What conclusions have you arrived at about sheep?
Sheep are not thick at all. I mean, trust me, what people tend to think of when they think of thick sheep is that they look at the most intensively industrially produced sheep, where people for the last 200 years have bred their brains and the native intelligence out of them. But if you breed some of the heritage breeds like we do that live in the mountains, live in their own natural habitat, they're really smart. My sheep know what the weather's going to do before it does it. They they take themselves to different parts of the mountain if it's going to snow or it's raining. They're really smart about looking after their young and getting them onto their feet and full of milk. They're just an animal that's very well adapted for what they do. And the bad reputation they've got of being stupid tends to be when we take them out of that, or we sort of breed out of them those natural instincts. It started about 200 years ago, and it's part of the industrialization of agriculture. So
Mass production.
So some smart people think, hang on a minute, can we breed sheep that have twice as much meat on them? Can we breed sheep that fatten, are ready for market in half the time? Just as happens with chickens and everything else at the moment. So some of the more, a lot of the lamb that lots of us would buy in the supermarket that isn't particularly tasty is a result of that process. It's 200 years of really intensive selective breeding, and that's okay. That you need some of that to feed the world. But I'm a champion of some of the heritage breeds, and in the UK we have 60 different historic sheep breeds, and they all were selectively bred over millennia to do particular things in particular landscapes. So my sheep are uniquely adapted to live in the really, really tough, wet, cold mountains of the Lake District. And I think that matters, particularly now. It matters in the future in terms of sustainability. If we want to produce food from marginal places like mountains in the future, and we almost certainly need to, then you need those things that emerged from the past and all that effort that went in over thousands of years by people before us.
Let's come to your social media identity and life.
Okay.
There is an incongruence. How did you discover Twitter, isn't it? Okay. Tweeting is what you do.
Yeah, I thought tweeting was a waste of time. I thought Twitter was a waste of time. I thought it was Kim Kardashian talking about a bottom. I thought that had nothing to do with my way of life and my values. And then I had some friends who persuaded me to experiment with it and to start tweeting from the farm and telling people the things that I care about. And I did that, and the response was ridiculous. So there were immediately hundreds and thousands of people started to follow that and show great interest in it. And I think my continuing to do it was born of the same motive as writing a book, which is there are things I care about that I feel that other people aren't saying as loudly as they should, and the things I wanted to fight for and tell people about. And I realised that Twitter was a way to do that. And to be blunt, it was also a way to put my writing out there, to show people that I like poetry, or I like writing, and it was one of the ways that I was able to get a publishing deal to publish my book, which was the bigger ambition. So I'm not going to knock the thing. It worked for me.
Uber lets you push a button to request a ride on demand. If you could have an app that lets you do that, press a button and request something on demand, what would that thing be?
I think it would take me home immediately, because that's where I like to be better than anything else.
It's been charming meeting you, James.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And give my love to the sheep and the farm.